It was a cool autumn evening, the kind where the air feels crisp and refreshing. A decorated military officer, recently promoted to the rank of general, was driving home after attending an awards ceremony at the Pentagon. He had swapped his uniform for casual clothes but still wore his service medal around his neck, a small reminder of everything he'd achieved through years of sacrifice and dedication. His car, a sleek sedan with tinted windows, glided smoothly along the empty roads of suburban Virginia. At a quiet intersection, he stopped at a red light, patiently waiting for it to turn green. Little did he know, this ordinary moment would soon spiral into something extraordinary and life-changing. Nearby, an officer named Daniel Grayson was patrolling the streets. Known among colleagues for his questionable behavior and history of targeting people based on their race, Grayson decided to run the plates of the luxury sedan sitting at the light. Something about the car caught his attention. Maybe it was the shine of the polished exterior, or the fact that its driver appeared calm and composed behind the wheel. When the results came back clean, Grayson should have moved on. But instead, he zeroed in on one detail. The name registered to the vehicle didn't match his expectations. It wasn't someone from around here, as he put it later. Without hesitation, he flicked on his sirens and pulled the sedan over, parking his cruiser dangerously close to the rear bumper. The general rolled down his window, his expression calm and polite. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unexpected interruption. Grayson leaned forward, shining his flashlight directly into the man's face. Instead of answering the question, he fired off another. "Where are you coming from?" Then another. "What's your hurry?" And another. "Do you always drive like this?" The tone was sharp, almost accusatory. Despite the tension building, the general stayed composed. He explained that he was returning home after an event at the Pentagon. When Grayson pressed further, asking why he was in such a nice car, the general simply replied, "I worked hard for it." But Grayson wasn't satisfied. To him, the situation felt suspicious. Why would a person like this, a black man in what he considered a wealthy neighborhood, be driving such an expensive vehicle? In his mind, it didn't add up. So, rather than letting the matter drop, he escalated things unnecessarily. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. For a brief moment, fear crept into the general's thoughts. He knew how quickly these situations could go wrong, especially for someone who looked like him, but he also knew better than to react impulsively. Slowly, he complied, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. As he stood by the side of the road, hands visible, Grayson began searching the vehicle without permission. Every drawer, every compartment, it was as if he were looking for something to justify his actions. "What's going on here?" the general finally asked, trying to keep his frustration under control. "I haven't done anything wrong." Grayson ignored him, muttering under his breath. Then, without warning, he grabbed the general's arm and twisted it behind his back. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the otherwise silent night. "You're under arrest," Grayson declared, his voice dripping with authority. "For what crime?" That part remained unclear. Passing cars slowed down as drivers craned their necks to see what was happening. Some pulled out their phones, capturing the scene on video. One brave bystander even stepped closer, asking if everything was okay. Grayson barked at them to stay back, threatening to make another arrest if they interfered. The general, now standing beside his own car in handcuffs, locked eyes with the growing crowd. There was no anger in his gaze, only a deep sense of disbelief and sadness. As the reality of the situation sank in, the general reminded himself to stay calm. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone watching, everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. He took a deep breath, silently vowing not to let this moment define him. Little did he know, karma was already setting the stage for what would happen next. The officer's grip was firm as he led the handcuffed general to the patrol car. The crowd that had gathered by now was buzzing with murmurs, some shouting questions while others recorded the scene on their phones. Despite the chaos around him, the general kept his composure. He knew better than to resist or argue. It wouldn't do any good. Instead, he focused on staying calm, repeating in his mind that this ordeal would eventually come to light. As the officer shoved him into the backseat of the cruiser, the general spoke up again, his tone measured but firm. "Officer, I'm a U.S. Army general. You can verify who I am. This is a misunderstanding." But the officer didn't seem interested in listening. "Yeah, sure," he shot back sarcastically, slamming the door shut. "And I'm the President of the United States." The comment stung, not because it was clever, but because it was so dismissive. The general sat quietly, staring out the window as the officer walked back to his vehicle. For a moment, he let himself feel the weight of the situation. Here he was, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, who had risked everything, in combat zones overseas, being treated like a criminal on his own soil. It was humiliating, infuriating, and deeply unfair. But beneath all those emotions, there was also a flicker of hope. He believed in the system, even if it sometimes failed people like him. And he knew that once the truth came out, things would change. Back at the intersection, the crowd hadn't dispersed. In fact, more people were arriving, drawn by the commotion. A young woman holding her phone stepped closer to the parked luxury sedan, filming the scene. "This is wrong," she said loudly, shaking her head. "They can't just do this to someone." Others nodded in agreement, their voices rising in protest. Someone suggested calling a lawyer, while another person started dialing local news stations. Word was spreading fast, thanks to social media. Videos of the traffic stop were already being uploaded online, tagged with phrases like "unjust arrest" and "Kwan's racial profiling." Meanwhile, inside the patrol car, the officer radioed for backup. His voice betrayed a hint of nervousness as he described the situation to dispatch. "I've got a suspect in custody," he said. "Claims to be some big-shot military guy, but I don't buy it." The general heard every word. He wanted to explain further, to show the officer his military ID or recite the number of his commanding officer. But he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Not yet, anyway. So he stayed silent, watching the flashing lights reflect off the windows as they waited for reinforcements. When the second patrol car arrived, the tension escalated. 2 more officers approached the scene, their expressions grim. One of them glanced at the general through the cruiser window before turning to the arresting officer. "What's going on here?" he asked. "He says he's a general," the first officer replied, rolling his eyes. "But look at him. Does he really seem like a general to you?" The general couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was this how justice worked? Could people really be judged based on appearances alone? He clenched his fists in frustration but forced himself to stay calm. Losing control now wouldn't help anyone. The new officers seemed skeptical too. They ignored the general's repeated requests to verify his identity and instead began discussing how to process the arrest. One of them leaned into the cruiser, asking gruffly, "Do you have anything illegal in your car?" "No," the general replied firmly. "You can search it if you want, but you won't find anything." The officer smirked, clearly unconvinced. "We'll see about that." Minutes later, the group decided to tow the luxury sedan and take the general to the station for questioning. As they loaded him into the second patrol car, leaving his vehicle abandoned at the side of the road, the general couldn't help but glance at the growing crowd. Some people looked angry, others concerned, but all of them were watching intently. He wondered how many of them had experienced something similar, or worse. How many had been pulled over for no reason, harassed, or worse, harmed, simply because of the color of their skin? The ride to the station was tense and silent. The general stared out the window, replaying the events in his mind. He thought about the sacrifices he'd made, the battles he'd fought, and the lives he'd touched along the way. None of that mattered to the officers who had arrested him. They only saw what they wanted to see. But he refused to let bitterness take hold. Instead, he focused on the bigger picture. If this incident could shine a light on the injustices faced by countless others, then maybe it would serve a greater purpose. At the station, the officers marched him inside, ignoring the cameras and reporters waiting outside. Inside, the atmosphere was cold and impersonal. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they led him to a holding area. One of the officers began filling out paperwork, asking routine questions about his name, address, and occupation. Each time the general answered truthfully, the officer raised an eyebrow as if doubting every word. "You're telling me you're a general?" the officer finally asked, leaning back in his chair. "Prove it." For the first time since the ordeal began, the general allowed himself a small smile. "Call my commanding officer," he said calmly. "He'll confirm everything." But the officer hesitated. Something in the general's demeanor made him uneasy. Maybe it was the confidence in his voice or the quiet strength in his eyes. Whatever it was, it planted a seed of doubt in the officer's mind. Still, he wasn't ready to admit he might be wrong. Not yet. As the minutes ticked by, the general used the phone provided to him to make a call. On the other end of the line was a senior official from the Department of Defense, a close colleague who immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. Within moments, wheels were set in motion. Calls were made, emails sent, and soon the story of the unjust arrest spread far beyond the confines of the police station. Outside, the crowd continued to grow. Reporters jostled for position, eager to capture footage of the unfolding drama. Social media exploded with reactions as hashtags like "Justice for the General" trended nationwide. People demanded answers, calling for accountability and reform. The pressure mounted quickly, forcing authorities to take notice. Inside the station, the officers began to realize they might have made a grave mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. Karma was already knocking at the door, ready to deliver its verdict. The mood inside the police station shifted subtly as the hours dragged on. The general sat in a small, dimly lit room, his hands cuffed loosely around a metal table bolted to the floor. He wasn't pacing or fidgeting. Instead, he remained eerily calm, almost detached. It was as if he had mentally stepped outside of himself, observing the situation like an outsider. Every now and then, officers would walk past the room, glancing in with expressions that ranged from curiosity to unease. Word was spreading quickly among the staff. This wasn't just another routine arrest. Something about this case felt different. Outside, the crowd grew larger and louder. People held up signs that read "Justice over bias" and "End racial profiling now." Some chanted slogans, their voices echoing through the streets. Reporters set up tripods and microphones, eager to capture every detail. Social media posts poured in from across the country, some sharing outrage, others offering support. The story had gone viral, fueled by videos of the traffic stop and eyewitness accounts. Everyone wanted answers. Who was this man? Why had he been arrested? And most importantly, why hadn't anyone listened when he said he was a U.S. Army general? Back inside, one of the arresting officers, the same one who had mocked him earlier, paced nervously near the front desk. His phone buzzed constantly, with updates from dispatch. At first, it was just local supervisors calling in asking questions, but soon those calls came from higher-ups, including officials from City Hall and even the Department of Defense. Each call seemed to make the officer more agitated. He muttered under his breath, running a hand over his face. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Had he made a mistake? Could this guy really be who he claimed to be? The general, meanwhile, continued to stay composed. He used the brief moments when officers left the room unattended to think strategically. Using the station's landline, he placed another call to a senior military official whose name carried weight. The conversation was short, but impactful. By the end of it, the official promised to send reinforcements immediately. "Don't worry," the voice on the other end assured him. "We're handling this." Minutes later, the sound of boots echoed down the hallway. A group of uniformed soldiers entered the station, their presence commanding attention. They weren't there to cause trouble. They were disciplined, professional, but their arrival sent shockwaves through the building. One of them, a high-ranking officer herself, strode directly toward the front desk, demanding to see the detained individual. Her tone left no room for argument. The officers on duty exchanged uneasy glances. No one knew what to do. Should they comply or dig in their heels and insist on following protocol? Before anyone could decide, internal affairs investigators arrived, accompanied by representatives from the FBI. News of the arrest had reached federal authorities, prompting swift action. The room buzzed with tension as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions from behind barricades outside. Inside, the general was finally brought out of the holding area. As he walked through the station, flanked by the soldiers, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Here was a man who embodied honor, integrity, and service, a stark difference from the chaotic scene unfolding around him. Officers scrambled to find paperwork, trying to justify their actions, but the cracks in their story were glaringly obvious. One of the investigators approached the arresting officer, his expression stern. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" he asked, gesturing toward the general. The officer opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. What could he say? That he'd assumed the worst based on appearances? That he'd acted out of habit, letting bias cloud his judgment? None of it sounded defensible now. As the general prepared to leave the station, the reality of the situation hit the arresting officer hard. This wasn't going to blow over quietly. Not only had he misjudged the situation, but he'd done so in front of the entire world. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating and unrelenting. Before stepping outside, the general paused for a moment. He looked around the room, taking in the faces of the officers, investigators, and reporters. There was no anger in his gaze, only resolve. "This isn't about me," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise. "It's about making sure this never happens again. To anyone." The crowd erupted into applause as he emerged from the station, surrounded by supporters and colleagues. Cameras captured every step, every smile, every tear shed by those who saw him as a symbol of resilience. But amidst the celebration, the general remained grounded. He understood that while this chapter of his life might be ending, the fight for justice was far from over. For the arresting officer, however, the nightmare was only beginning. Back at his desk, he stared blankly at the pile of incomplete paperwork in front of him. His phone buzzed incessantly, each notification bringing worse news than the last. Complaints from the public, inquiries from internal affairs, threats of lawsuits, it all piled up relentlessly. Worst of all, evidence of his past misconduct was coming to light. Old cases where he'd used excessive force or falsified reports resurfaced, painting a damning picture of his career. By the time he clocked out for the night, the officer knew his life would never be the same. Karma had arrived, swift and unforgiving, reminding him that actions have consequences. As he drove home in silence, the events of the day replayed in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of the general walking out of the station, dignified and unbroken. For the first time in his career, the officer questioned whether he deserved to wear the badge. The fallout from the incident hit like a storm, sweeping through the lives of everyone involved. For the officer who had made the fateful decision to pull over the general, the days that followed felt like a never-ending nightmare. At first, he tried to brush it off, telling himself that he'd been doing his job, that anyone in his position would have acted the same way. But deep down, he knew better. He could feel the cracks forming in his carefully constructed world, and there was no stopping what came next. By the time he reported for duty the following morning, the atmosphere at the precinct was tense. His colleagues avoided eye contact, their usual banter replaced by awkward silence. Some whispered behind closed doors while others openly glared at him. The once familiar halls now felt hostile, as if the walls themselves were closing in. When he sat down at his desk, he found a stack of documents waiting for him. Complaints filed by citizens, internal memos questioning his conduct, and screenshots of social media posts calling for his resignation. Each piece of paper felt heavier than the last, weighing him down with guilt and dread. But that was just the beginning. Later that day, internal affairs investigators called him into a meeting. They wasted no time getting to the point. "We've received multiple reports about your behavior during this arrest," one of them said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were photos, videos, and witness statements detailing every misstep he'd made. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was no denying what had happened. "Why didn't you verify his identity?" another investigator asked, his tone sharp. "You had access to resources, military databases, command centers, but you chose not to use them." The officer stammered, searching for an excuse, but none came. Instead, he mumbled something about procedure and protocol, though even he didn't believe it. The investigators exchanged knowing looks before delivering the verdict. He was being placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. Worse still, they hinted that termination might be inevitable, depending on what else they uncovered. It turned out there was plenty more. As the days went by, old cases resurfaced. Incidents where he'd used excessive force, falsified reports, or targeted individuals based on race. Victims who had long since given up on seeking justice suddenly found their voices again, emboldened by the national spotlight. Their stories painted a chilling picture of a man who abused his power without consequence until now. Facing mounting pressure, the department launched a full-scale review of his career, uncovering patterns of misconduct that stretched back years. For the general, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Though the arrest had shaken him, he refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, he channeled his energy into advocacy, using his platform to speak out against systemic racism and police brutality. Invitations poured in from all corners of the country. Community organizations, universities, even Congress wanted to hear his story. Everywhere he went, people greeted him with applause, gratitude, and tears. Many saw him as a symbol of resilience, proof that dignity could triumph over injustice. During one particularly powerful speech, he stood before a packed auditorium, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "What happened to me wasn't unique," he said, pausing to scan the crowd. "It happens every day, to people who don't wear medals, who don't have connections, who don't make headlines. My story matters because it shines a light on theirs." The audience erupted into cheers, moved by his humility and determination. Yet despite the praise, the general remained grounded. He often reminded himself that he hadn't fought this battle alone. Countless supporters, friends, family, strangers had rallied around him, amplifying his voice and demanding accountability. Without them, he knew things might have turned out differently. As for the officer, karma continued to deliver its reckoning. Stripped of his badge and facing potential criminal charges, he struggled to rebuild his life. Job applications went unanswered, landlords refused to rent to him, and former colleagues distanced themselves. The financial strain only added to his misery. Without a steady income, bills piled up, forcing him to sell possessions he once took pride in. Eventually, he landed a low-paying job as a janitor at a local high school, a far cry from the authority and respect he'd once commanded. Working among teenagers proved humbling. Some students recognized him from news reports and taunted him mercilessly, calling him a disgrace and mocking his downfall. Others, however, showed unexpected kindness. A group of kids started leaving notes in his locker, thanking him for keeping the school clean and encouraging him to keep going. At first, he dismissed their gestures as naive or insincere, but over time their words began to sink in, forcing him to confront the person he'd become. One evening, after finishing his shift, he sat alone in the empty cafeteria, staring at one of the notes. It read, "Everyone deserves a second chance. Don't give up." For the first time in months, he allowed himself to cry, not out of self-pity, but out of regret. He realized how much damage he'd caused, not just to others but to himself. The uniform he'd worn so proudly had become a symbol of fear and oppression, and he bore responsibility for that. Back in the public eye, the general's influence continued to grow. His advocacy inspired real change, prompting lawmakers to push for reforms in policing policies. Departments across the country adopted stricter accountability measures, including mandatory bias training and independent oversight boards. While critics argued that these changes weren't enough, many agreed they were steps in the right direction. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning. Yet the general never lost sight of the bigger picture. In interviews, He emphasized forgiveness, over vengeance, urging society to focus on healing rather than hatred. "I don't hate the man who arrested me," he said during one televised appearance. "But I do believe we need to hold people accountable, not to punish them, but to prevent this from happening again." His message resonated deeply, sparking conversations about empathy, redemption, and the possibility of transformation. Even the officer, watching from afar, found solace in those words. Though he knew he couldn't undo the harm he'd caused, he vowed to learn from his mistakes, to listen, to grow, and to become someone worthy of trust again. In the end, the incident served as a catalyst for change, not just for the individuals involved, but for the communities touched by their stories. It was a reminder that justice isn't always immediate, but it is inevitable. And sometimes, karma has a way of teaching lessons that stay with us forever. Months had passed since the night that changed everything, but its impact lingered like ripples in a pond, spreading farther than anyone could have imagined. The general, now thrust into the spotlight as an advocate for justice and reform, carried the weight of his experience with grace. He didn't seek fame or revenge, he simply wanted to ensure no one else would endure what he had. His journey wasn't easy. It required strength, patience, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But through it all, he remained steadfast, driven by a sense of purpose larger than himself. One crisp afternoon, he found himself standing on stage at a community center packed with people. The room buzzed with energy. Activists, veterans, students, parents, and even former law enforcement officers had gathered to hear him speak. Behind him hung a banner with bold letters, "Justice through Unity." It was more than just a slogan. It was a call to action, a reminder that real change could only happen when everyone worked together. As he looked out at the diverse crowd, he felt a surge of hope. These were ordinary people, mothers holding babies, teenagers clutching notebooks, retirees leaning on canes, but each one carried a shared desire for fairness and equality. They weren't there to dwell on anger or division. They were there to find solutions, to build bridges where walls once stood. "I never asked for this," the general began, his voice steady but warm. "I didn't wake up that morning thinking I'd become a symbol of anything. All I wanted was to drive home safely after a long day of service to my country. But life has a way of testing us, doesn't it? And sometimes those tests reveal things about ourselves and our society that we can't ignore." He paused, letting his words sink in. A young woman in the front row nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. Someone else clapped softly, breaking the silence before others joined in. Encouraged by their support, the general continued. "What happened to me isn't unique," he said, leaning slightly forward. "It happens every single day, to people who don't wear uniforms, who don't have medals pinned to their chests, who don't have cameras rolling when injustice strikes. My story matters because it shows how deeply these issues run, but it also shows that we have the power to fix them, if we're willing to listen and act." The audience erupted into applause, some rising to their feet. For many, his words resonated, on a personal level. A man in his 50s, seated near the back, wiped away tears as memories of his own encounters with prejudice flooded back. A teenage girl scribbled notes furiously in her journal, determined to share his message with her classmates. Even skeptics in the crowd found themselves moved by his sincerity. Meanwhile, miles away, the officer who had arrested him faced a very different reality. Life without the badge was harder than he'd anticipated. At first, he struggled to adjust to the monotony of mopping floors and emptying trash bins at the high school. Every time he walked down the hallway, he expected whispers and judgmental stares, and often he got them. Students recognized him from news reports and social media posts, pointing him out to their friends. Some taunted him openly, calling him names or making snide comments about his fall from grace. Others ignored him completely, treating him as invisible, but not everyone turned their backs. There were moments of unexpected kindness, small gestures that reminded him of humanity's capacity for compassion. One day, while cleaning the gymnasium, he noticed a crumpled piece of paper tucked under a bleacher. Curious, he picked it up and unfolded it. Written in neat handwriting were 3 simple words: "You can change." No signature, no explanation, just those 5 powerful words. At first, he dismissed it as childish nonsense. Who cared what some teenager thought? But over time, the note stayed with him, haunting him like a whisper in the back of his mind. Change. Was it possible? Could someone like him, a man defined by years of poor decisions, earn redemption? Determined to find answers, he started, attending counseling sessions offered by the department as part of his rehabilitation program. Sitting across from a therapist, he opened up about his fears, regrets, and frustrations. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, to admit that he'd been wrong. Not just about the general, but about so many things. The process was painful, forcing him to confront parts of himself he'd rather forget. Yet slowly but surely, he began to see glimpses of hope. Outside the therapy room, he made an effort to reconnect with his family. His wife, estranged during the chaos of the scandal, tentatively agreed to meet for coffee. Their conversations were awkward at first, filled with long pauses and unspoken apologies. But as weeks turned into months, they rebuilt trust, one honest conversation at a time. His children, too, started reaching out, sharing updates about school plays, sports games, and college applications. Though their relationship remained fragile, it was healing, one step at a time. Back at the high school, the officer noticed subtle shifts in how people treated him. Some students stopped teasing and instead greeted him with polite nods or quiet hellos. Teachers began acknowledging his efforts to keep the campus clean, thanking him for his hard work. Even the principal, initially wary of hiring him, expressed appreciation for his dedication. These small acts of kindness didn't erase his past mistakes, but they gave him something equally valuable: a chance to start over. For the general, the road ahead was still challenging. Advocacy work wasn't glamorous. It involved late nights drafting proposals, endless meetings with policymakers, and countless speeches delivered to indifferent audiences. But he persevered, knowing that progress rarely came quickly. Each victory, no matter how small, fueled his determination. When a new law requiring body cameras for all officers passed, he celebrated quietly, aware that it was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And yet, amid the struggles, there were moments of triumph. During one particularly moving town hall meeting, a young boy approached him afterward, clutching a drawing. In bright colors, the picture showed a soldier surrounded by smiling faces, with the words, "Thank you for helping us," scrawled across the top. The general knelt down, looking the boy in the eye. "This means more to me than you'll ever know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. In the end, both men, the general and the officer, were forever changed by the events of that autumn evening. For the general, it was a reminder of resilience and the importance of using pain to fuel positive action. For the officer, it was a lesson in accountability and the possibility of transformation. Neither journey was easy, but both were necessary, for themselves and for the world around them. The final chapter of this story unfolded not with a bang, but with quiet moments of reflection, moments that revealed just how much both men had grown since that fateful night. For the general, life had taken on new meaning. He was no longer just a soldier or an advocate. He was a bridge builder, someone who reminded people that even in the darkest times, there was room for hope and healing. His days were filled with meetings, speeches, and community events, but it was the small interactions that stayed with him the most. The handshake from a young activist inspired to make a difference. The hug from a mother grateful for his courage. The letter from a stranger saying, "You gave me faith again." Yet, despite all the progress, he knew the fight wasn't over. Change didn't happen overnight, especially when it came to deeply rooted issues like systemic racism and police misconduct. Every victory felt hard-won. Every setback a reminder of how far society still had to go. But he refused to let frustration take hold. Instead, he focused on what mattered, moving forward, one step at a time. One evening, after speaking at a local church, He found himself sitting alone on a park bench nearby. The air was cool, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. A teenage boy approached hesitantly, holding out a crumpled piece of paper. "I drew this for you," the boy said shyly. On the page was a simple sketch of a man standing tall, surrounded by others reaching toward him. At the bottom, written in bold letters, were the words, "Heroes help us stand up." The general smiled, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "Thank you," he said softly, folding the drawing carefully and tucking it into his pocket. "This means more than you know." For the officer, redemption wasn't something handed to him. It was something he had to earn, day by day. Life as a janitor wasn't glamorous, but it taught him humility in ways he never expected. Each morning, as he laced up his work boots and grabbed his mop, he reminded himself that every task, no matter how small, mattered. Keeping the school clean wasn't just about tidying up. It was about creating a safe space where kids could learn, grow, and dream without distraction. But the real transformation happened inside him. Counseling sessions became a lifeline, helping him unpack years of biases and bad habits. Slowly, he began to see the world through different eyes, not as a place divided by us versus them, but as a tapestry woven together by shared humanity. It wasn't easy. Some days, guilt weighed so heavily on him that getting out of bed felt impossible. Other days, memories of the arrest replayed in his mind, leaving him restless and ashamed. Yet through it all, he clung to the belief that change was possible, even for someone like him. At the high school, relationships shifted in unexpected ways. Students who once mocked him started seeking him out, asking questions about his past and sharing their own struggles. One afternoon, a group of seniors invited him to join their lunch table. They talked about everything: college plans, favorite music, and even politics. When the conversation turned to policing, the officer braced himself for criticism. Instead, the students listened intently as he admitted his mistakes and explained the steps he was taking to be better. By the end of the meal, they thanked him for being honest. His family, too, played a crucial role in his journey. Rebuilding trust with his wife and children took time, patience, and countless apologies. There were nights when arguments flared up, old wounds reopening. But there were also moments of laughter, forgiveness, and connection. On weekends, they started volunteering together at a local shelter, serving meals to families in need. It wasn't charity. It was a way to give back, to remind themselves that everyone has value regardless of circumstances. As months turned into years, the general's advocacy work continued to inspire change. Laws were passed, policies rewritten, and training programs implemented. Communities began holding open dialogues between residents and law enforcement, fostering understanding and accountability. Not every effort succeeded, but each attempt brought them closer to a fairer, kinder world. For the officer, karma delivered its final lesson in an unexpected way. One spring afternoon, while cleaning the auditorium after a school assembly, he noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was the general, visiting the school to speak to students about leadership and resilience. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, neither man moved. Then the general nodded, a subtle gesture yet loaded with meaning. After the event, the officer mustered the courage to approach him. I wanted to say thank you," he stammered, his voice trembling. "For everything. For showing me that forgiveness is possible, and for reminding me that we're all capable of doing better." The general studied him for a long moment before extending his hand. "We all make mistakes," he said simply. "What matters is what we do next." That handshake marked a turning point, not just for the two men, but for everyone watching. It was proof that even the deepest divides could be bridged with honesty, effort, and empathy. As news of the encounter spread, it reignited conversations about justice, redemption, and the power of second chances. People debated whether the officer deserved forgiveness, but most agreed on one thing. The general's response was a testament to the strength of character Years later, both men looked back on that autumn evening as a defining moment, not because of what happened, but because of what came after. For the general, it was a reminder that pain could be transformed into purpose. For the officer, it was a lesson in humility and growth. Together, their stories became a beacon of hope, shining light on the possibility of change. And so, the tale ended not with anger or resentment, but with a quiet understanding that justice isn't about revenge, but about creating a world where everyone can live with dignity, respect, and peace. Karma, in its own way, had served its purpose, not to punish, but to teach.